the largest source of domestic demand, which of course is a key driver of our growth. But we're looking at higher living costs now. There are concerns over unemployment, and there is an expected drop in India's exports. And keeping all that in mind, how can India maintain robust consumption and remain on its growth trajectory? To talk about what could be India's survival guide in a world that is facing financial anguish, please welcome on stage Mr. Surjit Singh Bhalla, former Executive Director, IMF for India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, and Sri Lanka. Namaskar, sir. A warm welcome to you. Please also welcome Mr. Dharmakirti Joshi, Chief Economist at CRISIL. Welcome, Mr. Joshi. And this session will be chaired by senior journalist Shankar Iyer.
Good afternoon. I wish we could start this session by singing Chura Liya Hai or any of the Asha Parekh songs, but that won't be happening. But we'll still try to get Dr. Bhalla and Dr. Joshi sort of give us some exciting moments on what's happening with the economy. I have some notes here, but I don't think I'm going to refer to them except for... Okay, that's a good segue to have. So, India's survival guide as India rises. So, Dr. Bhalla, welcome. Dr. Joshi, welcome. Let's try and sort of have this conversation in a way where I would ask you about because you have this glimpse of the world, the way all the hidden and unhidden conspiracies in the global economy. So we can have what are the challenges that India faces, what kind of duplicity or stuff that happens there. And Dr. Joshi can sort of give us a perspective of where we are, why India is still better placed than most other economies, and what needs to be done. So, Sujit, if you're okay, I'll start with DK. Give us a perspective, because the whole world is now talking about recession. There is this fear that what is happening in the US might visit us, partially, fully, wherever. But at the same time, there is this optimism, this buoyancy, which we see in the general commentary about India and even in the World Bank and IMF forecasts about 6+% growth, $5 trillion economy, the 5th largest economy, large domestic market. So just give us a perspective and then we can take this forward.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot for that question, and thanks the ABP group for inviting me. I think there's no doubt in my mind that the growth is going to come down from 7% that we are going to see in 22-23. Our forecast is around 6% next year. And there are 3 reasons for that, and I'll come to resilience after that. Number one is the global economy is slowing, and that's going to spill over to us. And the slowdown is largely in the advanced countries. It's the US and Europe where the extreme interest rate tightening is bound to slow down those economies. And that will spill over to us via exports, and the sectors which service exports are going to bear the brunt of that. By the way, India's exports to advanced countries are about 45%, and our growth cycles are almost nearly synchronized with those of advanced countries. Though our long-term trend rate of growth is divergent, but I think growth cycles are because we've got more interconnected with the world. So that's reason number one. Second reason why there will be some slowdown is because the central bank has been raising interest rates to control inflation. The only way in which the central bank reaches inflation is via slowing the economy. There's no other way. So some impact on the economy will be felt. Number 3 reason is the very messy geopolitics. I think when the world economy slows, commodity and crude prices should be crashing down, but that's unlikely to happen. The geopolitics is so messy that it will ensure they don't come down too much. So not too much benefit from global slowdown in terms of crude and commodity prices. But still, I think at 6%, India will still be one of the fastest growing economies, probably the fastest growing large economy in the world. Now, coming to the resilience part, I think there are several factors here. I think number 1 is the fact that the Indian corporate sector is in extremely good health. The balance sheets are very strong. They have paid back most of their debt, so their leverage is low, and they are in a position to invest if there is an opportunity, and the healthy balance sheet also provides them a support in terms of any global shock that comes. The second is our financial sector is cleaned up right now. I think the non-performing assets are very low, so you can start the cycle of giving out loans again. And I think so the financial sector is in a position to lubricate the economy as and when required. And then finally, I think there are 2 types of infrastructure that India is creating, and both of them are going to lead to efficiency gains in the economy. Infrastructure is being built at an unprecedented pace. There's absolutely no doubt about it. Physical, and even the central government budget is 1/3 increase in capital outlay. That's massive. Apart from that, digital infrastructure is playing out, and I'll just close with this, in 3 ways. I think it's providing a platform for innovations, so you have startups, etc. It's also leading to very efficient payment systems. And then finally, I think the digitalization has also allowed the government to reach out to the needy via subsidies, etc., without any leakage. I think this particularly was helpful during the COVID times. So I think the point I'm making is these set of unique factors actually make the country resilient. So I think it's going to there is a very strong wind coming from the global side. It's going to impact us, but I think it's not going to create a recession or a sharp slowdown of any of that sort. I think whether you get 6%, 6.5%, or 5.5%, that is, I think, any confidence interval around a forecast is very large right now. I mean, so because there are too many moving parts.
So Surjit, depends on which part of the geography you are and which portal you log on to, or which newspaper you read, or which podcast you watch. Uncertainty seems to be like a largely accepted consensus view. And then I always tell them that Paul Walker used to say uncertainty is the base case for all economies and all politicians, because you never really know what's going to come through. But there is this increasing anxiety in the financial markets in India. The Reserve Bank got its little shock kind of thing and they said that inflation is moderated, but now there is speculation that they will have to increase rates. Right? I know you have fairly, if I may call it, not radical, but contrarian views on how inflation is managed earlier in India, and now you have a global perspective. So I just wanted a sort of snapshot from you on, I mean, all the central banks have been raising rates by 50 and 75 basis points. They've raised, so if I use the US as a benchmark, so 5% from 0 to 5, they've gone. And their inflation has not come down 5 or hasn't come down even 2.5. And EU, I saw yesterday, is still around, Europe is around 8. So what is this whole thing? Get us past this long and variable lags in central bank policy.
Yeah. You know, there's an old saying that if you have 3 economists, you'll have 5 opinions. And I will conform to that. And the other saying is that we live in a world with increasing uncertainty. Now, I don't mean this as strictly as a contrarian view, but my perspective for the last couple of years, so it's not built on, is quite contrary to these 2 views. Let's start with inflation, which everybody is talking about. And I have a simple observation, and I'm sure all you have this. So if you find an answer to this simple observation-led conclusion, then I would like to hear it, whether from you or from anybody else. Look, for 26 years, dated from somewhere around, or 24, yeah, from 94, 96 to 2020, the world went through increasingly decelerating inflation rates, such that by 2018, 2019, the gap between a median developing country, emerging markets, and advanced country was only 1 percentage point. The emerging markets were at 3.5, the advanced countries were about 2.5. And this has been a steady downward trend. अब वो 25 साल से हकीकत चल रही है. बीच में what happened was COVID. I would call it the madness of policy and COVID. And after that, as the world was recovering, you had the madness of a war. Now, the reason I'm very optimistic is that COVID has ended, and with it, hopefully, we will all learn lessons of our madness as to how we treated COVID or the unfortunate existence of COVID. And the war, and maybe my genes are DNA's plus, the war will also end soon. And then I ask you this: what has happened for inflation to continue at the rate the US Fed seems to be thinking? You know, the interesting thing about the US Fed, and I'm sure you have written on it, I've written on it, we've all written on India's response to inflation over the last 30, 40 years was drought ho gaya, food shock ho gaya, inflation aa gayi hai. Ab hame kya karna hai? Tighten monetary policy. If somebody can explain to me how tightening a monetary policy affects a food shock, I would love to learn. The exact reality is monetary policy has precious little to do with supply shocks, and I would say now monetary policy has precious little to do with inflation. Look, we are in a very globalized world. We all recognize that. And in this globalized world, it's international wages, it's the international supply of human capital, and the supply of savings that makes it almost impossible. So I will go out on a limb. Malpass, the outgoing World Bank president, just said yesterday, I think in Mumbai or Bangalore, that look, the world had better get used to much higher interest rates than what we had, the abnormally low interest rates over the last decade. Pretty much. Now, I would ask him, what has changed? Why we need to answer, since it was world markets that determined the low interest rates, वो policy makers ने तो नहीं किया. वो इसलिए low थे, inflation low थी. अब मेरे को बताओ, why would inflation come back?
Okay.
Just tell me. So I think, now coming to the last part, India, we are at a very, very fortunate place. I must say, as a 74-year-old, I never thought we'd be at this place. And I think we will only benefit more from this changed globalization, the interest rates that will come down, inflation that will come down, and no thanks to policymakers that inflation will come down. Let me make it clear. No thanks to the RBI, and no thanks to the US Fed. So I think we are fantastically well placed, and this is our next 2-3 decades.
Okay, Surjit, so I'm going to ask you to sort of re-wear your hat as a former member of the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council and say if the Prime Minister asked you tomorrow, this is like a binary answer. Really. Should RBI be increasing interest rates now, yes or no?
No.
Okay. Now
Simple, straightforward.
Okay. So, DK, the influence of financial markets on central banks or the influence of central banks on financial markets, we don't know. But if you read, if you watch the business channels, if you watch news channels, there are people popping out and saying that we are entering into a high cost, low growth phase in the global economy. So beyond the interest rate issue, which I of course want you to say whether interest rates need to be hiked or not need to be hiked, what is the other challenge, like in the short run, for price stability, for growth, that India needs to do? And since we are on short time, so I wanted to take a couple of more points so we can keep the responses tighter.
Yeah,
Surjit?
I think I agree with Dr. Bhalla to the extent that the monetary policy doesn't control supply shock. But I think, but I would also like to add that if the supply shock becomes persistent, just as you're seeing wheat inflation at 12-13% for last 1 year, then I think it starts flowing into other parts of the economy. And that is what the rate hike controls. And so I think there is a role for the central bank policy. I think in terms of extreme supply shocks, I think it becomes a little less. I think that's what I would say. And right now, I would believe that the central bank has raised rates enough, and probably it's time to now pause.
So आपके हिसाब से RBI ने अभी जो रेट बढ़ोतरी कर रहे थे वो नहीं करना चाहिए, अभी थमना चाहिए उसको?
नहीं, अभी हो चुका है, and now I think we are approaching the pause.
Pause.
Pause, हाँ.
अभी एक pause पे होना
Pause
चाहिए.
पे, हाँ.
Okay. So,
yeah.
So we were looking at the challenges as India heads towards a 5 trillion mark, and then there are forecasts of a $10 trillion economy ahead. Now those are all arithmetic and economic elements, forecasts and demographics and all those things. There is no doubt that India is entering into a sweet spot, like a Goldilocks period. So if in your work and through your analysis, what are the 3 or 4 things, quickly if we can go through them, what needs to be done? And then, Surjit, I want you to sort of elaborate on the challenges that we face, because when India rises, how do the powers that feel diminished respond to these, the rise of India? Okay, just hang on. Yeah, Dick.
Well, I think from the challenges perspective, right, what we need to address, I think one challenge that is facing us is the climate. I think there's absolutely no doubt. I think I have been talking about the economy for 33 years. Nowhere in my presentation I mentioned climate change as a risk to the economy. I think it suddenly appeared in the last 2-3 years. And we are seeing that. I think India is probably the most vulnerable country. So from an agriculture perspective, we need to ensure that there is enough storage, etc., so that supply shocks that will come from climate impacting agriculture are taken care of. I think because food is still a major part of our inflation basket. I also want to add that I think the way we measure inflation is also important. I think we have a 11-12 base, which is very old. I mean, the consumption pattern has changed dramatically over the last 10 years. So I think the inflation numbers that you see are not that accurate. So that is, I think, one. Second, I think India is moving towards a growth path which is focused on infrastructure, which is focused on manufacturing. Now, both of them are carbon intensive. When you create infrastructure, steel and cement, you carbonize the economy. Manufacturing is more carbon intensive than your services. So how are you going to make it leave less carbon footprint while you industrialize? I think that's going to be a challenge which needs to be addressed. Then I think very quickly, the last part I would say is that when we look at the long-term growth dynamics, capital investment is happening, efficiency will flow in digital infrastructure, physical infrastructure, but the labor, I think, is not equipped for that. And I think just very quickly, I think if I just give you one statistic, the 50% of India's labor force is below secondary school and they don't have any skills. So I think you can't fire the economy with such low skills. So I think the point is labor will become a constraint. I think of the three factors, capital will be there, efficiency will come from some of the reforms, but the quality of labor, I think, can become a constraint for India, and that needs to be addressed.
So climate resilience, skills, and watch out for how you move, what is the balance between the composition of the thing on, when you say manufacturing creates a greater carbon.
If you leave a higher carbon footprint, you will going to face higher tariffs from Europe,
okay.
etc.
That's exactly where what we were discussing in the morning, Surjit. So now you have a perspective of this. You've seen this at close quarters when you were at the IMF and earlier also. There is always a response from the diminishing empire about a rising empire.
Yeah.
Or a diminishing power about a rising power. We see that in play in the US-China thing, and now increasingly about India. So in my research or readings, I have found that there is suddenly an increased preference for ESG, environment, social, and governance, which affects portfolio flows, FDI, whatever, which might make our, the flows costlier or constrained. The second is this whole drama in European Union has conceived now about carbon tax on products coming from India. So if Mr. Jindal or the Tata Chorus is exporting steel to European car makers, they might be subject to tax. This is the kind of fear they have, plus the textile where we have competitive advantages. So what's happening there? Why is this happening?
I think you said it, in the beginning very rightly, that there's a challenge to a rising empire from a diminishing empire. And I think that really puts into correct perspective about what's happening in the world vis-a-vis India and what's happening in India vis-a-vis the diminishing empire in India. In India also, I had said it in terms of...
Surjit, we're not going to the diminishing empire.
But, but I think, see, that psychology puts in perspective, which is, it's winners and losers. And losers don't like to continue losing. But they can't really strike at the inevitable. So I think we are now at a stage where, as far as there are elements, obviously, of outside of India who look at India as a rising threat. Fortunately, the global economy today, vis-a-vis now the big rising threat for the last 10, 15 years, was China. Now, for various reasons which we won't go into now, that threat has really, really diminished. I think that's one of the biggest shocks to the world as to how fast that threat is diminishing. Look.
So 1 minute, just for our audience. Yeah. When you say that threat is diminishing, are you raising doubts or are you convinced that China may not necessarily be head where people say it will be the largest economy or the single biggest force on the planet?
China, look, we all have discussed this, and I know I've been on programs with you on, China grew at 10% or something for 20, 25, 30 years. And no other country has even come close. And it did that because of aiding and abetting by the West, and in particularly the US. The US, there's a very interesting book by Rush Doshi, an Indian, you might have seen that, about that how the US views China. And how China views the US. China basically sees the US, the decline of the big empire, and they will rise to that occasion. That is not happening. This is where I think it's very fortunate that as the world started turning, I think with Trump, and when it happened, he saw the threat of China. When it happened, most Westerners dismissed it. Most liberals dismissed it. And now Biden and the US has doubled down on their anti-China or whatever, containment of China, etc. So we are now, because we saw that in the first program about the shared values that India has with everybody outside of China and Russia, with the Western powers, whether it's Japan, whether it's England, whether it's the US, whether it's Germany. So I think this is, I think she called it the alliance of the willing or whatever, but this is a real fortunate occurrence that the decline of China comes at a time with the rise of India, and not because, India is not rising now because of China, but what it means is that our acceleration in our rise will be aided and abetted by the West and by the willing. So I think we are, just as when everything, that's not to say that, look, I don't want to come out with their education quality is a major challenge to India. How do you improve education quality? How fast do you deregulate? We are possibly one of the most regulated economies in the world even today. And how fast we deregulate will determine how fast we rise. But I'm very optimistic on both counts. We have reached a level of education today that was considered impossible. An equality of education between men and women. There are more women in Indian colleges today than there are men. And this is a society that had son preference, this, that, and so much so that they needed a slogan, or needed a goal, Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao. And that's only 8 years ago. And, so basically, all the elements are in place. It is our strength. And I think we are now entering a brave new Indian world. So I'll end it there.
So we have a view of how India's domestic economy is solidly placed. Dr. Bhalla has given us an idea of why we are in sort of an interesting Goldilocks period in the geopolitics of the world.
Yes.
And so we have economic factors and geopolitical factors. And I just hope that in the next few years, we don't sort of mess up the domestic politics to stall the engine of growth. And with that, I'm being signaled there to wind up. So thank you very much. This is not a subject that can be covered in 30 minutes or 40 minutes. You got to have probably a full pravachan session from Dr. Bhalla and then Dr. Joshi. We should try and do that again. Thank you very much. Thank you, DK.
Thank you very
Surjit.
much. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Of course, we've got a sense of the opportunities that India has to accelerate. It just depends on us how much we want to push it forward. Thank you very much. I'd like to invite on stage Rajesh Krishnamurthy, Business Director from Himalaya Wellness.
Where the software engineer meets the smart market analyst, meets the gifted content writer. To create the big dream, the world comes together at Sharda University. So where are you?
आइडियाज ऑफ इंडिया को प्रेजेंटेड बाय डाबर वैदिक टी, चाय का वही लाजवाब स्वाद अब सेहत के साथ। को पावर्ड बाय डॉक्टर ऑर्थो, अब दर्द भी घुटने टेकेगा। गैलेंट एडवांस टीएमटी सरिया निर्माण का रियल हीरो। अब आएगा खाने में असली स्वाद राजेश मसाले के साथ। ड्रिवन बाय मारुति सुजुकी। टेक्नोलॉजी पार्टनर क्रिएट टुडे एनरिच टुमारो पैनासोनिक। गोल्ड पार्टनर सेंको गोल्ड एंड डायमंड्स, डिजाइन ऑफ इंडिया फॉर यू।